Hey folks, thanks for stopping by. The last episode, if you tuned in, you saw me cut the dovetails for this hand tool case that I've been working on. And here we're going to work on the shelf. So first we got to flatten the thing. The marks that I'm making on either side of the board signify which way the grain is running, and this tells me the direction of travel that my hand plane needs to go to avoid tear out. I mark it with an arrow, mostly for visual sake, so that you can see what I'm doing, and then I just simply plane in that direction. And you can imagine petting a cat where you're wanting to pet it from front to back to lay the hair down. This is exactly what I'm doing with the wood fibers. I'm pushing them down, essentially, as I go forward and cut them, and that will give me a nice clean surface. And on this board, just like the previous ones, I bring out the big boy, the Stanley Bedrock 607, to help me do some heavy stock removal and get this thing flattened a little bit quicker. Once I have my face flattened, I can put my edges flat, square, and 90 degrees to that initial face. There you can see the surface my hand plane's left, nice and shimmery and smooth. And here are some of the tools that I'm going to be using to cut the housing dados for this. This is simply an adjustable square, nothing special. A marking knife, anything, even a box cutter would do here, just something to scribe a line with. This is a 1-inch chisel. I'll use that to make a trench for my saw to ride in while I cut the housing dado. This is a 3/8 chisel, and I just like a smaller chisel to knock the waste out with. It requires less force to move through the wood than a wider one. The saw I'll be using is a Japanese, it's actually a crosscut saw. I use it for dovetails, but it has nice fine teeth. If you didn't have a Japanese saw, then a Western style saw would work just as good. And here's a small crosscut saw by Veritas. It's a fantastic saw, but I get better results with the Japanese saw. I just simply have more practice with it. And the final tool that I'll be using is a router plane. This is a Stanley number 71. I picked this thing up at a flea market for $20. It was a heck of a find, and it'll put the bottom of the dado nice and flat and coplanar with the top. So I chose my measurements for the dimension of this case very specifically. You can see here I've got about 30 and 7/8 between the inside of one dovetail to the other, and this was intentional. The bed of my Stanley Bedrock plane, as you can see here, is 22 inches long. I knew I wanted a shelf when I was designing this hand plane cabinet, and so I needed to decide how far down I was going to go. And for me, it made sense with the size of my largest hand plane to be 22 inches, to put the shelf 10 inches from the bottom, I should say the top of that shelf. You can see here that even if I stood this, my longest hand plane, straight up and down, it would fit. Although I'll be putting it at the angle you see here, it'll be leaned back slightly, and I'll put a shelf behind it with dividers for all of my hand planes. Now I'm just putting some nicks in to begin laying out for my housing dado. It's important to note when you're doing a joint like this that a knife really is superior in every way to a pencil. It'll help your saw to track first off, but it'll also sever the wood fibers and give a much cleaner cut, making it much more likely that you'll actually end up with a 90-degree corner between your shelf and the outside of the cabinet. So as I'm marking these layout lines, it's important to note that when you're making cuts with a marking knife, all of your initial cuts need to be very light, otherwise the knife will try and follow the wood fibers. So by making one light pass and just severing the fibers just barely, you can come back in and follow on top of that initial pass with a much heavier cut, the second, third, or even fourth strokes, and it won't follow the fibers. It'll stay nice and straight and true. And here's a quick look at my layout lines. The one on the left is noticeably darker. You can tell I had a heavier hand when cutting that one. To lay out my next line, what would be for the bottom of the shelf, I'm going to reference off of the shelf itself, and I'm just going to take a minute here to make sure that it's squared up to both my layout lines that I had just marked. In a perfect world, this shelf would be exactly 1 inch thick all along its length, but fortunately we don't live in a perfect world, so it's a much safer bet to actually reference off of the piece. That way you're measuring as little as possible, and it lowers your chance of messing something up inadvertently. And once I've got my lines across my face, I just simply carry them around the edge of the board, so that way I know where my depth is, and again, this will help my saw make a cleaner cut by having those fibers severed already. Now I'm going to use my router plane, which I already have set to a depth of about 10 millimeters. That's a little over 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to use it to mark the depth of my housing dado. I'm doing this again so that I'm not going off of a measuring tool and then what I'm actually using on the piece. I much would rather use the router itself to make that mark. And you can see here my pencil line actually veered off of the line I cut with my router, thanks to that knot, and those 2 knots that you see there basically gave me a fit throughout the entire process. Now I'm just taking my 1-inch chisel and chipping out a little bit of the waste off of my knife cut, and this is just going to give my saw a little bit of a trench to ride in when I make the cut, and just ensure that it doesn't want to wander. Now I just take my time starting this. This is a wide board. They're a little over 7 inches wide, which is a lot for a saw of this size, so I'm really going to take my time and try and make sure that I get my cut established nice and square and straight. So it might be a little hard to see from this angle, but if you can see the reflection of the board in the plate of the saw itself, it's more or less in line with the actual edge of the board, and that's how I know by eye that I'm cutting it roughly 90 degrees to the face of the board, because the reflection itself isn't going off at some weird tangent. And as I mentioned earlier, I really don't like using a 1-inch chisel to knock the waste out. This little 3/8 will be perfect, just because it requires less force to knock through the wood. And here I switch sides and chisel in from both ends just to avoid blowing out the fibers by going all the way through from one direction. Once I'm finished chiseling and I'm close to depth, I bring in the router plane and true up the bottom all the way across, taking it to approximately the same depth. You can see I'm actually having a little bit of problems. I didn't clamp the board down nearly securely enough, so it's kind of bouncing around as I'm trying to make this cut, but ultimately it didn't affect the finish and I was able to get it done. As I was watching this back, it occurred to me that I used the side of the board to test the fit on this housing dado. I have no idea why. It's the end of the board that will be going in, but ultimately what matters is that it fit and it held itself in there. And you can see with just one pipe clamp, I'm able to hold the entire assembly together. The joints aren't perfect, but they're not bad. They're straight and square, and most importantly, they're good and strong. So the case itself is pretty much done and ready for glue up. And I'll probably be driving some dowels in to hold that shelf. Here you can see the dovetails that I cut in the last episode. So I'm really looking forward to getting this hung up. I'm probably going to use a French cleat on it. I think that'll be the best course of action. Once I get the front panel on, you won't even be able to see it while it's hanging. And this monstrosity will come down. This was a holdover from the previous homeowner. The clamps will find a new home, hopefully on the left-hand side of my workbench. And my sharpening station will live in that left corner. The glue and all the accessories will go in those two slot holes where I have wood. Those hand planes will find their new home in the case we're making, in addition to the hand planes that live on my bench. So as always, thanks for stopping by. I hope this inspired you to get in your shop or creative space, and I really hope that you'll join me on the next episode where I imagine we'll be making the panel for the hand planes to ride in. Thanks again.